Hey, let me set up this video for you real quick. Today I want to preach about Jesus and the Sabbath day, which I know Sabbath may not be a word that a lot of us use or we think about when it comes to our spiritual lives. For some of us, there's been this resurgence in the need for some Sabbath principles. But as far as we know in the life of Jesus, we get about 3 years of his public ministry, which meant Jesus honored about 150 Sabbath days in his public ministry. And we have stories about 9 of them. So there are 9 days that we read about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in which Jesus is doing something on a Sabbath. And I want to talk about that today because it reveals things about Jesus' character, hopefully inspires us a little bit, and it helps you see how Jesus is not just about rule keeping, but life-giving. So it's not just are we keeping rules, but how are we living our lives to where life is like it's spreading because of us. So I know that there's a few of you who have been an inspiration to me that you have adapted some Sabbath principles in your life, and one of them is Brent Patterson, one of our shepherds here. And Brent wasn't able to be here this morning, but I asked if Brent would shoot just a short video for us to see in Brent's life what Sabbath has meant for him. So check out this video, and then I'll take the sermon from there.
So Josh asked me to come up on stage this morning and share a little of my story, but we're on the road this weekend. So I recorded this less than 50 for 50 production quality video. So see how this goes. In late 2022, I began to realize that the intentional and unintentional ways my life was ordered, my rule of life, although I didn't necessarily have that language at the time, was leaving me mentally and emotionally exhausted. My hurried calendar and overall busyness had filled almost every waking moment of my life. Moments that weren't scheduled became time to catch up or get ahead. I was spent in so many ways, and everywhere I looked, church included, some consistent level of hurry and busyness and hustle was totally normal, even admired. In the midst of all that restlessness, some voices started to become influential in my life and began to make me aware of a gift that God had blessed and set apart for me that in 47 years of life, I hadn't really been told much about or encouraged to open. That gift is woven into God's design for his good creation and remembered throughout the pages of Scripture. That gift is Sabbath rest. So for the past year and a half, I've been opening and enjoying that gift every week by observing a day of Sabbath in several different ways centered around 3 W's: work, worry, and want. From sundown on Saturday night till sundown on Sunday night, I make every effort to stop producing and creating and just rest from work, vocationally and otherwise. I found that a lot of my worry originates from the little computer that I carry around with me everywhere I go. So I untether from text messages, email, social media, and my phone in general, sometimes even locking it away in a box for 24 hours. I take off my watch. I rest from making any purchases other than food on the Sabbath and quit feeding my want, which has also helped greatly by putting my phone away. Those are the things I've stopped doing 1 day a week. And stopping those things have allowed me to find a rest that only God can provide. Rest that I can't take, only receive. My Sabbaths have become not just a day where I worship in the morning and spend the rest of the day catching up and getting ahead on everything else, but a day to just be and appreciate the life God has blessed me with and to rest in his presence. Sometimes I find that rest on a long, slow walk, sometimes in an actual nap, sometimes in being able to be present to my family and friends because I have nowhere else to be. Observing Sabbath every week feels like living into God's purpose for my life and living the rhythms that he created me to live. Has Sabbath eliminated hurry and worry and want from my life? Absolutely not. But it has given me a perspective that I didn't have before. Jumping out of the river for a full day every week has allowed me to see the river for what it is and to recognize how it's forming me in ways that I couldn't perceive while I was swimming in it 7 days a week. Sabbath has become the best day of the week, the day each week that I both protect and anticipate.
All right, so let's begin in Mark chapter 2. In Mark 2, Jesus makes two claims about himself. And one of them is this. Jesus says, I am, the Son of Man is, the Lord of the Sabbath. So of course Jesus is Lord of all. But he doesn't just go around saying, I'm Lord of all. There are times Jesus makes specific claims. So this isn't just a day that God created like any other day. Jesus claims to be the Lord of it. Now, I know when some of you hear the word Sabbath, you may think Old Testament. I mean, after all, look, Sabbath shows up in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. You get the Sabbath that shows up a few times in Acts. But after that, you get Colossians chapter 2 and Hebrews. You just get one reference to Sabbath. That's it. So it's not like the New Testament talks a lot about Sabbath. You also don't have the New Testament, and I would even argue Colossians 2 doesn't do this, that says the Sabbath isn't important for us anymore. Now, some of you, when you think Sabbath, you may think it's not for me, or it's one of those sermons that may make me feel guilty for my pace of life. And I don't want to do that today. And some of you hear Sabbath, and you think about a rest that you so desperately desire, but you don't even know how to dream about it. Like it just feels like rest is so far from you. So the word Sabbath, about just slowing down, saying no, you see this play out in the life of Jesus a few times, and I'm going to briefly walk through the 9 stories where it shows up. Now, to frame these stories, when Jesus and Sabbath show up together in your New Testament, like red light should be going off in your head. Because usually when Jesus is on a Sabbath day, there is going to be confrontation and a bunch of surprises that happen. So predictability about a Sabbath doesn't happen in the Bible. Like I really wish we had an example of Jesus waking up on a Sabbath and it was just normal and calm. Like Jesus woke up and he sat on the porch. Jesus wrote in his gratitude journal. Jesus made some coffee with hazelnut creamer and sugar because Jesus had flavor and personality, right? Like Jesus worked out. Jesus went on a walk. Jesus hung out with a few friends, and then Jesus went to sleep. But we don't have those. Anytime you see Jesus and the Sabbath show up, there are a bunch of surprises. Now, for me, in my entire preaching career, like I don't like being predictable. It's why I never begin a sermon the same way. I don't want people to ever think, well, Josh always begins a sermon with a joke, and then he reads a scripture, and then he has 3 points, and then he lands the plane. Like, I want to begin a sermon in a way where you don't know exactly how we're going to get into a sermon for the day. The first year of my preaching career, I was preaching from Matthew chapter 25, where you have this story of Jesus. It's a parable he tells about the sheep and the goats. And it's Jesus, in the story, he says, look, there are those who were hungry, and you give them something to eat, or someone's thirsty, you give them something to drink, and what they really don't know is that they're actually doing this for me. And sometimes when we neglect to give food to the hungry or water to the thirsty, you're neglecting God. So he tells this parable. So for this to come to life, I talked to one of my friends, Drew, and I said, man, and Drew always had, he was real scruffy the way his beard was, and I said, dude, look, and I wasn't trying to minimize homelessness by doing this, but I said, I want you to come to my church on Sunday, and I need you to pretend to be a homeless person. And I just want you to sit outside, and I just want to see if or how the church will interact with you. And then I want you to come in the church, and if no one invites you in the church, I'm going to make sure you get in there. And then I had this part of my sermon where he was going to play a part in it. So he shows up on this Sunday, and I was preaching in this little church, about 100 people, and the church was kind of divided. There were half of the people in the church who wanted to go care for him, and half who wanted to call the police. So I'm having to tell the people who are trying to call the police that they don't need to, that we have it under control. And then I witnessed people who started taking donuts and coffee, and a 10-year-old boy named Taylor who gave this guy, my friend Drew, who he thought was just a homeless guy, who gave him his Bible. He wanted him to have a Bible. There was a woman who got really mad at me because she thought I should be doing more. And then I had the elders who pulled me aside, and they did not fire me in the moment, but they said, in the future, when you do things like this, will you just let us know? Just give us a heads up. So a few people end up inviting him into church. So he comes into church, and they're sitting on the back row, and I start preaching my sermon, and I get halfway through my sermon, and I start quoting Matthew 25. I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. But as I started to quote Matthew 25, Drew starts quoting Matthew 25 from the back row. And his voice gets louder as my voice fades. And Drew comes down the aisle, looking into the faces of the people in our church, quoting Matthew 25 of I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. Or I was hungry and you did not give me something to eat. And that day, about half the church responded to my sermon. I'd never seen so many people. It was like Pentecost. I don't know to this day if I've had more people respond to a sermon with tears in their eyes because people were saying today, I didn't know what to do when I showed up at church and I saw him outside. And when he started walking down that aisle, I looked up and I thought it was Jesus. And for some of them what they said was today, he was Jesus in my life, needing to wake me up to what God's doing. But what I didn't anticipate is how this was going to mess up the next few months of the life of that church, how people in that church treated guests because they thought every single one of them was a sermon prop. It was like, hey, you're here today, you're in the sermon, right? Like, this is how guests were being treated when they came in. It was like this surprise element. And I like surprise elements because I don't like predictability. But when it comes to Jesus on a Sabbath day, like nothing's predictable. Whether he's walking on a road or in a synagogue or he's hanging out with people, like there are surprises everywhere. So let's walk through them real quick. Now, I told you just a minute ago, we have probably about 150 days, Sabbath days, in Jesus' public ministry, and we get stories of 9 of them. Sabbath story number 1, it happens in Luke chapter 4, and I'm going to do my best to what I think is in like a chronological order of these. And in Luke chapter 4, and it says this in verse 16, that he went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. And Luke tells you a couple of times Jesus does something as was his custom. This was his practice. What Jesus would do is he would wake up on a Sabbath day and he would go to church. He would go to synagogue where they would read scripture. There would be some teaching. They would pray some prayers, maybe sing a song. It was God's people coming together on the Sabbath day. And he does it as was his custom. Now, the response to the teaching Jesus gives that day in the synagogue, and if you look at the next slide, this is the first time Jesus is rejected on a Sabbath. And in verse 22, people are amazed by what he has to say. By verse 28 and 29, they want to throw him off a cliff. So within just a few verses, they love him and they want to destroy him. Now, I get to preach what I think is one of, if not the greatest church in the world. And you treat me and other ministers so well. I have friends who wake up every month, preacher friends who they dread waking up on Monday mornings because of the amount of emails and messages that come to them critiquing sermons from Sunday or worship services from Sunday. And I don't have that. I mean, every once in a while, there have been moments in a lobby in a parking lot when 2 people will talk to me, and one of them will say something like, that was the best sermon ever. Thank you for how God speaks through you. And the other person is pushing back on something I had to say. Or the 2 emails will pop up in my inbox in which one is like, that was the best Sunday ever. And the other is, if you ever do it again, I'm never coming back. You know, every once in a while this may happen. But I've never had a moment when someone affirmed something and then threatened to take my life because of what was said. Now, what happens in between those 2 moments is Jesus tells people that the promise that was given to Abraham way back in Genesis about this movement of God being something for all nations. At some point, it stopped being plural about nations and became singular nation. And it was really hard for people to grasp a move and a vision from God that included everybody being invited into this story. So when Jesus painted that vision for them, they wanted to throw him off a cliff. Sabbath story number 2. You get this in a couple of different Gospels. And in this one, Jesus is in a synagogue, and he's teaching. And the way the story goes is it sounds like it's not until like the very end of church that day, the very end of synagogue, after Jesus had been teaching, that someone in the crowd had an evil spirit, and the evil spirit was awakened. Where the evil spirit gets loud, and the evil spirit, through this person, knows who Jesus is. And there's something about this, that when you are in the presence of God, in community, where a focus is on the power and presence of God, and we're told in these stories that Jesus is teaching with the kind of authority that people had never heard before. And there's something about the authority of God and the power and presence of God that can call evil out of people and evil out of a room. So there's here in just a few minutes, we're going to have a communion time and time where prayer is going to break out around this room. Like Stoney and Lance are going to be our two shepherds today. And we're going to have Rachel and Kim Chapman and myself receiving people for prayer. And almost every Sunday what happens is that there is some way people experience the power and presence of God in a worship service, that either evil or an obstacle is in the process of coming out of them, and they share that with someone else to pray over them because they want to be free. There's something about this story at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry that when the power of God is on display, evil can't stay in its presence. And this is the only story you have of Jesus on a Sabbath day in which there's no opposition, in which he is not rejected. This is the only one. Sabbath story number 3. Jesus and his disciples are walking through a grain field. And all his disciples do is this. They reach out their hand, they take some grain, and they eat it. And there were Pharisees who were spying on them, because there were some Pharisees who thought it was their job to police the rules of the Sabbath day. So there were some people who their hearts were more about policing rules than it was about pursuing the heart of God on the Sabbath day. Like there's some people who stepped into a Sabbath day and their motivation was to be critical, not to pursue God. And Jesus ends up having a conversation with them in which Jesus is bringing out some Old Testament stories of a couple of moments when people went against the law of God because they were hungry or they're trying to take care of people. Sabbath story number 4. As Jesus goes into a synagogue and he's teaching, and in that synagogue there was a person with a withered hand. A person with a withered hand was not on their deathbed. They were not about to die. The person with a withered hand isn't coming to Jesus to be healed. But Jesus is in a synagogue with a person with a withered hand. And it makes you wonder, how many times had this person been in synagogue? What was their status in synagogue? How were they treated in synagogue? And if you look in Mark chapter 3, what happens is Jesus in verse 4 and 5, Jesus calls this person to come forward, like come and stand by me. And in verse 5 of Mark 3, it tells you that Jesus is angry and he is grieved by how hard their hearts were. And Jesus heals him. And the response in Mark chapter 3 is the Pharisees team up with the Herodians, who these groups of people had not been friends. They team up to come up with a way to kill Jesus. That's their response. Sabbath story number 5. Jesus is in Nazareth. And he's back in the synagogue, and this is his hometown. Nazareth was not a big town. And in this story, Jesus is just teaching, and there's opposition because now people start questioning him. Isn't this Joseph's son? So like his status is being questioned. Was Jesus trained in the right place? Where was his degree from? Like all these things. And it says that they opposed him. They were offended by him. And what it tells you, and it's kind of sad when you read in verse 5, that what happens is Jesus, it says he healed a few and then went along his way. It's almost like the power of God in that moment was on Jesus to do so much more. But he chose in that moment, because of their opposition, to just heal a few. Even if he would have healed one, it would have been awesome, right? He healed a few. It's like Jesus wanted to do so much more for his hometown. And it says Jesus was amazed by their lack of faith. Sabbath story number 6. And what happens in this one is Jesus is back in a synagogue in Luke chapter 13. And there's a woman who had been crippled for 18 years. It actually says like there's a spirit in her that has crippled her. She's hunched over. She can't sit up straight. And it doesn't say she is there begging Jesus to heal her. Jesus is at synagogue and notices a woman who has been ill for 18 years. And the first thing Jesus speaks over her is a word of freedom. He wants to set her free. Then Jesus touches her, and her back is made straight. And the very next response by the leader of the synagogue is he was indignant. Because there are other days of the week you could come and perform a miracle like this. But for him, Jesus was violating the Sabbath. Sabbath story number 7, Luke chapter 14. Jesus is in the home of a Pharisee. So he goes to the home of a Pharisee, and have you ever entered into a meeting before or an appointment where you knew confrontation is what you were about to run into? And Jesus steps into this house of a Pharisee to eat a meal on a Sabbath day, and there in the room is a person suffering from dropsy. Now, there are different ideas of what dropsy is. Most believe that dropsy is what we would call edema. It's the building up of bodily fluid under the skin, in your arms, sometimes your legs. I mean, in a way, you're like puffed up a little bit. It's not going to kill you, but it's very uncomfortable. And Jesus notices someone in his presence who has dropsy, and Jesus decides to heal him in the moment. Now, the way I interpret the story is there's like this snicker on Jesus's face where he's like almost using this person as an object lesson of, you think this person is the one who is puffed up? Really, it is all of you around this table who are puffed up in your mind, thinking things about God that are not true about God, treating the Sabbath in a way that doesn't bring life to other people. Sabbath story number 8, John chapter 5. Jesus ends up going to a pool of Bethesda or Bethsaida, depending on what version you read. And there, when he gets to the pool, it's a pool surrounded by people who are sick and ill. Jesus doesn't go to this place and just accidentally ends up there. I think on this Sabbath day, Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. Jesus wasn't afraid to go to places that were hard places to enter into. So he enters into this place where there's been a lot of suffering, and there's a person there who had been ill for 38 years. We're not told exactly why he was ill. We assume it was something with his legs because he couldn't get into the pool. And Jesus asks him a question in John 5, do you want to be made well? Because there are some people who become victims in their life, who they don't, like healing is something that would rob them of 4 decades of what their life has become. And the man never says yes to Jesus, but Jesus heals him. And then you look, if you go to that next slide, and John, actually, and this goes with this story of John 5. And John 7, verse 23, Jesus is referring back to that moment. And he's talking to the Pharisees in this moment of, if a boy can be circumcised on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses may not be broken, why are you angry with me for healing a man's whole body on the Sabbath day? And Sabbath story number 9 is a story of a blind man. And this is a story that they're walking down a road. There's a blind man who is there. And it says that Jesus' disciples begin to ask the question, who sinned, this person or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus reframes this idea of faith and suffering. And then Jesus does what Jesus often does when it comes to healing some people. There are moments when Jesus speaks a word and they are healed, or he just touches them and they are healed. And then there are moments like this where Jesus spits on the ground, makes mud, and puts the mud on eyes, and then asks a blind guy to walk to the pool of Siloam to wash in the pool, which wasn't just down the street. If I was one of his disciples, I would have been like, Jesus, he's blind, but he can hear you spit. Jesus, he's blind. Why are you asking him to walk way down to the pool of Siloam? And there are moments when God is performing a work in someone's life that he's inviting them to do something to enter into the moment. And a response from the leaders, if you go to the next slide in John 9, is in verse 16, some of the Pharisees said, this man, he's not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. All right, so here's a summary slide for you. I want you to see it. As far as we know, on the Sabbath day, Jesus has 9 Sabbaths that we read about. And there are 2 or 3 walks that he does on those days. 8 of the 9, there was opposition. 5 of the 9, Jesus is in some kind of teaching role. And we have 5 specific healing stories. And of the healing stories we have of Jesus on the Sabbath day, none of them involve people who seem to be on their deathbed, and none of them involve people who come to Jesus begging to be healed or have friends who are bringing them to Jesus to be healed. Jesus takes the initiative. Because maybe Jesus is in synagogue or around synagogue, and he sees the way people are being treated. And for Jesus, Sabbath is not just a day where you keep rules. It's a day that you spread life. It is a day you rest. And it's a day that should benefit all people. So there are 3 different times in the stories I refer to you to this morning where Jesus even asks questions to people like, hey, if an ox or a child falls down into a pit on a Sabbath day, won't you lift them up? Then why can't we spread life in all these other areas of life on the Sabbath day too? Did Jesus honor the Sabbath? Yes. Did Jesus ever teach against the Sabbath? No. Jesus was rooting a day in the promises of God. If you go all the way back to Genesis, and in Genesis chapter 2, in the creation story, we first read about the Sabbath. And this is God who on day 7, it says this, by the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all of his work. And then God blessed the Sabbath day, and he made it holy because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. And I always, whenever I teach on Genesis 1 and 2, I try to point out, look, God was not in need of, he wasn't in desperate need of rest after creating for 6 days. Like God created more with his mouth than he did with his hands. But we don't get the sense like God's in need of a massage therapist or Gatorade to quench his thirst. God is setting forth a rhythm for humanity. The language of Sabbath doesn't mean people are asking to be lazy. It's that we have a great work ethic and we rest the way God is inviting us to rest. In fact, the Sabbath is probably the only of the 10 commandments that we don't honor to this day. We honor all the other 9. But the one about Sabbath in Exodus 20 probably gets more words added onto it than any of the other commandments. In the 10 commandments it says this, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, and on it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. This is even for your cows and for Rufus and Grizz and all your pets. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the Sabbath day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. In Numbers chapter 15, you have this story of somebody who breaks the Sabbath and the community decides to kill them, have them killed. Jesus was not just about rule keeping, but spreading the life of God everywhere he went. So Jesus makes a claim in Mark chapter 2 that he's the Lord of the Sabbath, but he makes another claim in Mark chapter 2 as well. And in verse 27, Jesus says, the Sabbath was made for humans, humankind, not humankind for a Sabbath. The way Jesus frames the Sabbath in Mark chapter 2 is this was a gift from God given to humanity. And you get to do with that gift what we get to do with any gift that a human being gives us. We can choose to open it or set it aside. I don't know why, and maybe I do, that there seems to be a resurgence among people and when it comes to the Sabbath, like an interest, this resurgence, and maybe we need some Sabbath principles in our lives. And I think a big reason why, and Brent touched on it in his video earlier, is I think there are a lot of people, and probably a lot of you, who are unsatisfied with our hurried, busy, distracted lives. And we crave more rest. I'm going to throw just a few quotes at you and bring this sermon to a close. And Parker Palmer, referencing the Sabbath, says this: burnout typically does not come about because we're given so much of ourselves that we have nothing left. It merely reveals the nothingness from which I was trying to give in the first place. Like it's living from this place of emptiness. When Sabbath principles are meant to remind us who really is God and it's not us, who really is keeping the world going and it's not us. John Tyson says our busyness is destroying our pace, eliminating margin, and deeply affecting our bodies. My mentor, Randy Harris, sat with me and a bunch of preachers back in 2010. And Randy sat down with us and he said, hey guys, these cell phones that you have right now, and this is in 2010, like smartphones were just something new. And he said, these cell phones are going to make you into bad human beings. Try to resist it. Right, now fast forward 14 years. And as Brent referenced earlier, like you carry these around and they run this is like an organ. There was a group of people, research done, they put them in a room and they said you have to go an hour without your phone, or every 15 minutes you have to suffer from a form of electric shock and you can keep your phone. And over half the room, they said, we'll take the shock. Just don't make us put it down for over an hour. And how many of us can make it through even a worship experience without playing a game or looking on Facebook or checking your Ring notifications and whatever else may come in? When it comes to saying yes to God, it means we got to say no to some things in the world to say yes to God in some deeper ways. Dallas Willard says hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life in our day. Marva Dawn says this about the Sabbath. On the Sabbath day, we deliberately remember that we have ceased trying to be God and instead have put our lives back into His control. Concentrating on God's lordship in our lives enables us to return to His sovereign hands all the things that are beyond our control and terrifying us once those things are safely there. And as long as we don't, forgive me, Jim already said it once today, as long as we don't stupidly take them back again, our emotions can find truly comforting and healing rest. And the last one for you is this. Sabbath is a scheduled weekly reminder that we are not what we do. We are who we are loved by. So I want to invite you into this moment of communion and prayer by this way. We see Jesus on the Sabbath day initiate contact with people. Like Jesus is looking for people to set free and to speak words of rest over. So why would Jesus not initiate that with you today? And it seems that almost every Sabbath day, Jesus that we read about, Jesus is disrupting things. He's disrupting people. He's disrupting social circles. He's disrupting things. And maybe it's a moment like this that in His grace and mercy, Jesus wants to disrupt a few things in your life. But as we take the bread and the cup, there is a rhythm that we celebrate. And it's the rhythm of death, burial, and resurrection. And there is a rhythm that Jesus is inviting us into today. A rhythm of work, laughter, joy, grief, and rest. So step into this rhythm with Jesus today. Will you bow your heads and close your eyes? For God, as we move to the tables here in just a moment, or as we go to pray with some of our prayer warriors around the room, Jesus, for all you have done to promote and advocate for life for all people and all creation, thank you. And for the death you died to give us life, where there is freedom and rest, thank you. And God, will you come with a loud voice or with a gentle whisper to invite us into the rest you promise and that you give. And it's in and through the name of Jesus we pray. And the church said, amen.